Our July Zazenkai reading from the Hekiganroku Blue Cliff Record, Case 33, Shinso Sho comes to visit Shifuku. Engo's introduction. He does not distinguish east from west or north from south. From morning to evening, from evening to morning, so he remains. Can he be called asleep? Sometimes his eyes are like shooting stars. Can we call him wide awake? Sometimes he points to the south, calling it the north. Tell me, is she mindful or mindless? Is she a person of enlightenment or mediocrity? If you thoroughly understand this topic and know the secret of it, you will realize how the ancient masters went this way and that. Tell me, what season of life is this? See the following. Main subject. Shinso came to see Shifuku. Shifuku drew a circle in the air. Shinso said, I have no object in coming here. Why do you bother to draw a circle? Shifuku closed the door of his room. Parentheses, Teisho says, Shinso has only one eye. Teisho's verse, perfect the circle, pure the sound, bright and abundant the encircling jade, loaded on horses and mules, loaded on board the iron boats given to those who know the peace and freedom of land and sea. He put down the tackle to fish the turtle. Teisho comments here, monks throughout the world can't jump out of it. Not much is known about Shifuku, yet this case demonstrates that he was an outstanding Zen master. He comes from the Dharma lineage of the Igyo school, the grandson of Kyozan, who in collaboration with Isan founded the Igyo school, which relied heavily on symbols like drawing a circle in the air, an enso. The key here is monks throughout the world can't jump out of it. We're all contained inside this circle, this enso of the very source or fabric of the universe. How can we be separated from it? We're always a part of it. There's nothing that's not a part of it. And to have that feeling that nothing is a part of this circle, of this matter of life and death, and the very origin of the universe or the multi-universes. To have the feeling is to be in communion with what I've called the intimate infinite. Very intimate and very infinite. When we're having the feeling, there's a certain peace of mind and humility that comes with that allows us to meet any and all challenges that we face in our lifetime. Of course, we're not always having that feeling of deep communion. And when we're not having that feeling, everything seems to get narrow, and we can often feel overwhelmed. I think of the times in all of my Zen practice from when I began in approximately 1975, how my first brush with the intimate infinite were so clarifying and wondrous and wonderful. And then life in various ways intrudes. About, 10, 15 years later, I began to have revelations about my own early abuse history and sunk into an addiction with MDMA in order to help process that, along with my psychoanalysis with my analyst. But I wondered at that time of my revelations about my early abuse history, what good was Zen? I was overwhelmed. I was addicted. I had very much lost this sense of clarity and peacefulness and open-heartedness. In hindsight, having passed through that phase, which took only about 10 years, I recognized that without the foundation of Zen practice, one, I may never have even approached my early abuse history in any conscious way. It might have just remained repressed, and my life would have been so much more narrow had I not met it and processed it. So without Zen practice, I couldn't have gone to hell and back. That's in hindsight. In the midst of hell, I had great doubt about the value of this practice and training. Then came all of my trouble and fright with Edo Shimano. This was in part in conjunction with my early abuse history, because I was transferring my father kind of fright to Edo Shimano, and there were times traveling to Daibosatsu in New York where literally I felt like I was getting on a plane as a captured convict who was going to be executed. And it literally felt that horrifying. And again, I began to question, what good is this practice if this is how I feel after well over a decade or two of training already, and I feel this frightened by something I knew intellectually wasn't even true? I wasn't going to a death chamber. I was going to a sesshin. Again, in hindsight, having passed through that sort of artificial barrier, I came to realize that without Zen practice, I would have never been able to do that transference work, meeting the fright of my own father and processing it with doing sesshin with Edo Shimano. So again, it was the launch point of being able to do the work and processing that history with my biological father through my transference with Edo Shimano. It was because of Zen practice that I could get to that level of fright and begin to process. Then when the whole thing with Edo Shimano began to collapse in 2010 because his own early issues, I presume, were complicating his ability to grow and mature, and he was still, even after great consternation and angst in previous incarnations of the New York Sangha and had already made a great big mess of things, was making a mess of things again. And I thought, my God, here's somebody who's been doing Zen for 60 years and he can't get any more mature than this. What good is this practice? Truly, I thought at that point, at each one of these points, I'm done with Zen. It's given me whatever it has given me, and I don't need any more of this. Then this temple here at this location of Chobo-Ji opened, and I broke my connection with Daibosatsu, and we became sort of an independent stream of Rinzai Zen practice. And I was feeling pretty good. Things seemed to recover. There was a kind of recovery. And then I went through my own hell of being investigated by my own Sangha for potential ethical violations. And that process was so torturous. And I felt so wounded that I strongly considered giving up being abbot and just walking away from Zen again. And it concluded with a crushing letter from Genko Osho and the complete collapse of our long relationship. Indeed, I had made some mistakes that I regret, but nothing in my mind, even to this day, justified the amount of torture my poor ego felt over the course of 4 or 5 months and longer because of the destruction of my relationship with Genko and others in the Sangha. I thought, this is worthless. Taking a deep breath and going straight on and continuing to live into sessions and coming back to a sense of communion with the intimate infinite and feeling, sure, wounded, but also humiliated and ultimately humbled. And frankly, more mature for the process. Chalk it up to more maturity along the way. Then working with Bernie Glassman Roshi and going to places like Auschwitz and Rwanda and later to South Dakota and Alabama, and I missed the trip to the old Yugoslavia. What about Cambodia or Yemen or Sudan or the terrible things going on in Palestine or China or Ukraine, or the fact that we can't seem to, as human beings, rise to the occasion to lay down dependence on fossil fuels so that we end up cooking ourselves in our own atmosphere. How is Zen practice going to help with all of this mess that we've created for ourselves inside of the human condition? Is it really useful? Still, I have my doubts, considering the degree of inequity and injustice just in this country alone, let alone around the whole globe. It's still curious to me how we can be so damn ingenious and caring and corrupt and sadistic, all in the same package. Is there any place for Zen practice? Well, My answer today is yes. First of all, it allows me to face this huge range of the human condition and not shrink from it. Occasionally feeling kind of overwhelmed, but not shrink from our own human condition, personally and collectively. And there's a certain, humility and humbleness and simplicity that arises from the ability to just meet our personal and collective complexity and still manage to have a caring heart. I was talking to Joriki, who's Osho, in Pennsylvania the other day, and many of you know that he's had many back operations, and then he had an operation on his arm, and the pain a couple of years back was so bad that here was this Zen Osho, well over 40 sessions, 20 years of practice, who was having panic attacks. And he said to me, because the pain was so persistent, chronic, and emergent, and he was not getting adequate care, that he would just show up at the emergency room in the middle of a panic attack, feeling as though he might have a heart attack or a stroke, and at least he would be in the right place if that came to be. And usually just by going to the emergency room repeatedly, he could calm down enough to come home in the midst of terrible, 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 urgent pain and live another day. But he said, damn, after 20 years plus of Zen practice, I'm having panic attacks because of pain. Hadn't I learned the minimum thing that I had learned from Zen was how to meet pain? One of the things I thought was, didn't say to him, but one of the things I thought was, my God, if you didn't have 20 years of Zen practice, how much worse would it have been? As bad as it was, as overwhelming as it was. And looking in his face and his eyes, I could see a new depth of maturity because of this terrible suffering, and humility, and sort of any sense of puffed upness just eliminated. He swears he's going to come back to Chobo-Ji and do more sessions. You know, it's hard for me to imagine. And yet, even for all of his doubts, he's willing and prepared to go straight on with this kind of practice and training. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish east from west, north from south, morning to evening, evening to morning. Are we asleep or are we awake? Are we narrow or are we wide? Are we fooling ourselves when we call north south or south north? Are we being mindful or mindless? Are we awake or just in mediocrity? The truth is, between confused and overwhelmed and clear and open-hearted, at our best, we're going to bounce between these qualities. We're going to bounce between mindful and mindless. We're going to bounce between excellence and mediocrity. If we know this much, we're in on the secret that there's no arriving. Tell me, what season of life is this? See the following. Shinso, who was known as Shinso Sho, which was a title of a government official corresponding to a minister or a deputy minister in China, and was very well versed in Zen, and most comers could not penetrate or defeat him. However, in this case, one imagine he comes to investigate Shifuku, and Shifuku, when answering the door at the knock of Jinso, just begins the conversation by drawing a circle in the air, maybe this way. Clearly the beginning of some sort of Zen dialogue, as in, what do you have to say about the Absolute? That which encompasses everything and from which nothing is ever apart. And Shinso responds, why do you bother drawing a circle? I come here with no particular object. Maybe I've come just to say hello. Why are you bothering with this Zen dialogue about the Absolute? And to many people who might have been in Shifuku's place, Shifuku might have felt defeated by that kind of response. Why do you bother drawing a circle? I didn't come to play games. I just came to say hello. Shifuku, however, was not defeated. Instead, he just closed the door. Kind of like saying, well, if you don't want to have a real conversation, I won't bother. So the koan becomes, if you were presented with this enso, in the beginning of a Zen dialogue about the Absolute, how would you respond? There's nothing wrong, by the way, with Shinso's response. Comes entirely in the relative, and even the relative, when done expertly, can defeat someone coming from the Absolute, because it just pops their bubble of being, say, dependent or stuck in the Absolute. But this was not what was going on for Shifuku when he closed the door. So how do we respond to this Zen dialogue about, look, we're all a part of one fabric that has no form, let alone a name. We can never be separate from this intimate infinite that informs and animates everything. And indeed, when we feel it, we can meet any and every crisis with a certain peace of mind and open-heartedness and caring action. Yeah, when we're feeling it, and we're not always going to be feeling it. and we can never arrive to where we're always feeling it. And in fact, every suffering and crisis and doubt, when used properly, leads to something we call more maturity, more humility, more ordinary mind is Tao, more simplicity, more genuine, caring heart-mind activity that has no purpose other than to, as best we can from where we are, care for all relations. I think everyone knows that Carolyn and I did a Zen Peacemaker retreat quite recently, where we went to Wyoming and Montana with Lakota elders from South Dakota and experienced some sacred sites with them that they had heard about but never been to themselves. And why? Because they grew up on the reservation, and some of them were native Lakota speakers, but were completely worried that their language is nearly annihilated because of the whole boarding school situation in the last 50 to 100 years that pretty much eliminated almost all native languages, or damaged them so dearly that there are very few native speakers of any of the native languages. Just how cruel and cultural genocidal is that? You know, these tribes have been on this continent for well over 10,000 years. 10,000 years. And the wave of immigrants from Europe nearly destroyed most of their culture in the last even 50 to 100 years. It's just tragic. One story we heard about young boys who had been taken to the boarding schools, and if they spoke their native language, they would be hit, and their hair was cut. And they understood, having been taken as small children away from their parents. Imagine being a small child being taken away from your village and your parents. Taken away, captured, kidnapped, then tortured, told you can't speak your own language, and cutting off your long hair, which for the boys meant that if not only were you taken from your parents, but if your hair was cut, there was a belief that your parents must have died. They died. So now you've been kidnapped, tortured, and essentially told that now your parents are dead. Dead to you. And many children did not survive this. How cruel we can be to each other. You know, there's plenty of food in the world, and yet people are starving, even in this country. How cruel can we be to each other? So this idea that we're all a part of one fabric, and even when we glimpse the truth of it, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and we feel great peace and great clarity and great wonder and great love, what good is it? Liable to lead to a great deal of doubt perhaps sufficient doubt to certainly puncture that bubble of open-heartedness and love and care and respect for all relations. Would you all like to know how to proceed? Indeed, this koan, how do you respond to Shifuku's circle, is part of the key of how we go straight on and be ordinary and caring and open-hearted in the midst of such suffering. Shinzo almost had it when he said, I have no object in coming here. No purpose. Fine. Then how do you proceed with no purpose? In the midst of such conflict and suffering, how do you proceed with no purpose, no goal? How do you proceed with no purpose, no goal, but open-heartedness and respect for all relations? If we really use this koan well, we come to a transcendent response on how to proceed in the midst of global suffering.
Shujo